Coming up, what does the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act mean for the future? And a rock opera rewrites colonial history in California. Plus, we take a look at Arctic Games developing survival skills. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. ASU offers the only online undergraduate digital media literacy degree, teaching students how to recognize and combat inaccuracies on all platforms. They are using cutting-edge tools and tactics to separate fact from fiction in a digital world overloaded with misinformation. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hoopa. Thank you for joining us. We start in Washington, where Congress has voted to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. Last week, the House and Senate passed VAWA as part of the $1.5 trillion federal spending package. The Hallmark Law gives resources to victims of domestic and sexual violence, and the 2022 version of VAWA includes a tribal title which addresses some major needs for Indigenous communities. The bill maintains the right of tribal nations to arrest non-Native perpetrators over crimes of dating and domestic violence. What's new is that it restores the rights of tribes to prosecute non-Native offenders for crimes involving child violence and sex trafficking. It also gives tribal nations in Maine and Alaska the right to exercise tribal jurisdiction. Both of these states had previously not been able to do so. Leaders in Indian countries celebrated the news, including NCAI President Fawn Sharp. She said, "The historic tribal provisions in this bill attest to years of powerful collaborative efforts between survivors, tribal leaders, and allies across Indian country." Mike Williams, the chief of the Akiak Native community, said, "The Alaska Pilot Program and Alaska Native Village jurisdiction is pivotal to transforming the public safety crisis in Alaska." VAWA had not been renewed since 2013. The bill now heads to President Joe Biden's desk to be signed into law. Officials from the Biden administration heard directly from tribal leaders last week in another round of engagement sessions. The closed discussion was led by the White House Council on Native Affairs, and the topic, protecting sacred sites. The conversation was led by the Council's Executive Director, Morgan Rodman, and by Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland. Rodman spoke to ICT, saying federal partners are listening to the needs of tribal leaders who want to protect their places of significance.
I hope that it was conveyed that the people on the panel, on the federal panel, are really invested in this. This is an opportunity to make some long-lasting positive changes that respect and support protections for sacred sites. And it was evident from the participants, the non-federal participants, this is really important.
In addition to leaders from federally recognized tribes, leaders from Native Hawaiian organizations attended too. One of the goals from the session included having conversations with tribal leaders early in decision-making processes and ensuring consultation processes on sacred sites. The listening session was held in response to a memorandum of understanding signed last fall. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's painful for some to see how much it costs to fill up at the pump, but the addiction to fossil fuels goes way beyond that. Bottles of water or brooms. In fact, just about any household product is made from plastic, and much of that plastic comes from China, and before that, it's oil from Russia. Driven by growing concerns around ocean pollution, many tribes are already moving away from plastic use. Mike Childs Jr. is treasurer for the Prairie Island Midwakaton Dakota tribe. He speaks about his nation's motivations to make the move.
Yeah, we switched away from some of our plastic products we use. In our like our cups and our food containers, instead of them being styrofoam or plastic. I mean, we try to switch away from that stuff as much as possible. And, sometimes, we're questioned because it's more expensive, but I mean, really, is it? I mean, is it more expensive to have compostable containers or plastic flying around?
China is the largest importer of Russian oil. In Florida, indigenous Taino art from Puerto Rico is being showcased in Miami. The Museum of Graffiti is highlighting street artists with a special exhibit called Estilo Boricua, which translates to Puerto Rican style. A large population of indigenous Taino people moved from Puerto Rico to the area in the 1950s, and though the Wynwood neighborhood has changed, indigenous art is still reflected on murals there. The show features 9 different artists who have created work for stars like Jennifer Lopez and Missy Elliott. To read more about the incredible art, visit IndianCountryToday.com and search for the headline, Museum of Graffiti Features Taino Exhibit. Coming up, Alaska Natives enter a new era after the 50th anniversary of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And we look at games in the Arctic that develop survival skills. But first, a rock opera tells a new story about the settling of the American West. Stay with us. Johann Sutter is a hero in American history books, a pioneer in the start of California. But there's another side to the story. He exploited, enslaved, and raped indigenous people to build his empire. The Native American rock opera, Something Inside Is Broken, tells the true story of those natives whose entire way of life was destroyed in the name of progress. The play is written, composed, and directed by Jack Kohler. Let's take a look at a clip.
Their solution to the Indian problem was to kill, murder, exterminate, or domesticate.
Which meant legalized slavery.
Hello, Jack. Welcome to the ICT Newscast.
Thanks for having me, Aaliyah.
So give us a rundown of this play.
Well, this is the very beginnings of the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis in California. So it takes place in about 1846. It's a true story. Well, it's based on a bunch of true stories combined together to make one story. But this is based on true stories. And it's about two lovers, one who gets kidnapped from her tribe and forced to be a slave for Sutter. And he used her in many ways, not only as a house servant, but he also next to his house in Sutter's fort, he had a room where he kept sometimes 10 to 20 young Native girls. and I don't need to go further on explaining what happened there. But the young man decides the young Native man decides he's going to volunteer to be a servant at Sutter's Fort. He incites a riot after he gets there. A lot of them escape, and he rescues his wife-to-be. But there's tragic consequences because his brother is working for Sutter as well, but in Sutter's army. And Sutter forces the brother to either find his brother or his tribe's going to meet another fate. So without giving away the show, it's a tragic story, but we did it as a rock opera, as a musical, because we could tell the story without being very depressing, because it's a depressing story. You know, all of Native American history, there's a lot of conflict and depressing ends to Native peoples. So we did it with rock music, because rock music can be right in your face and tell you something that you don't want to hear, but you listen because it's good music and it's pumping through you. And so hopefully people can take in the story without getting too depressed, but still understand what really happened in 1846 with Sutter and how he treated the natives in California. I wrote this story with Alan Wallace, who came to me early on and said, "Hey, can you write the script for my show that I wanted to include something about the gold rush?" But I decided, as we were going through our research, we decided to start with Sutter, which was just prior to the gold rush, because he had already started kidnapping young Native girls and boys, and he would use them to trade with people that he had borrowed money from. So he was using them as pawns. So Alan Wallace asked me to write the script. As I was writing the script, these songs started flowing to me. And then I'd sit down at the piano and I'd bang out a few songs. And pretty soon I had written like 17 songs to this play. And we just went with it, because originally it was supposed to be a play with about 7 songs. And now it's a rock opera with 28 songs in it. So
Jack, this might seem like a really obvious question, but I'm curious, why was it important to you personally to be able to, 1, research these histories, but then 2, to share the true history of what happened to Native people and Native children in California?
Well, the true history is not taught in our public education. And California has always been idolized as the Golden State. It's a dream state. People went there and found their gold and their riches, but they never told the whole story about the people that suffered because of this. When gold was found, 300,000 men, mostly men, migrated to California, and so Native Americans were inundated with all these men who had ideas of becoming rich. A lot of them were rough. They carried guns. And their idea was, with Manifest Destiny, the idea was, well, you shoot first and then you ask questions later, especially if you couldn't understand the person you're trying to talk to. And then usually it wound up into becoming a conflict, only because people couldn't understand each other. And it was easier to just use your gun than to try to figure out what these natives wanted. And what we were doing wrong. I'm speaking about the gold. I'm speaking about the miners. What we did wrong coming to California looking for gold. So usually questions weren't asked, and it usually led to violence.
Jack, I have one last question. We have about a minute left. 1, where can people find this play? And 2, what has been the reaction from it?
So the play we filmed it while we were on tour, and I had no idea we were going to turn it into a film. We just decided when we were going on tour, we'd film every single show. And then we had such good footage, we decided, okay, well, let's try to compile it into a movie. So far, it's won 12 awards around the world. It won a Native American Music Award for Best Rock Album. And at the end of this month, it's playing at the French Film Festival in Virginia. So hopefully it'll continue on, and hopefully some producer out there who runs a theater is going to see it and say, hey, I want this show in my theater. And that's the hope, is that it makes its way into more theaters and gets performed around the country. Because it's a story about what happened to all Native tribes across the United States. We just used California as our grounding place.
Well, Jack, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's March Madness for basketball, but there's another competition in Alaska. We take a look at the World Eskimo Indian Olympics held last year in Fairbanks. These games showcase traditional methods needed to live in the cold Alaska environment. ICT's Quindrea Yazzie shows us how they are turning skills to hunt seals into games that people who plank for exercise would envy.
The seal hop is a game of endurance and strength. In this push-up or planking position, the athlete has only knuckles and toes touching the floor. They hop forward as far as possible. This game mimics a seal's movement and is used by hunters trying to get closer to the seals. Kyle Worrell from Juneau, Alaska, hopped over 154 feet, blowing out his competition. He says the sport is based on the skills needed to hunt seals.
The story behind the game is that this was based on a hunting technique to sneak up to seals laying out on the ice floe. And so hunters realized if they simply tried to walk up to a seal, the seal's going to see them come and it's going to dive down back in the ocean, and they're going to lose that opportunity to have a seal to bring home to feed their community.
Welcome to the 60th Annual World Eskimo Indian Olympics, where athletes are excited to get back into competition after having a year off due to the pandemic. Samantha Mogg, like many athletes, participated in more than one event.
I do Eskimo stick pull, Indian stick pull, grease pole walk, and ear pull.
Medals are bestowed upon those who show great strength, agility, and persistence. However, the competition is much more than that.
It's called the Olympics or competition, but really it's a celebration of our culture and our people. And so you go to the event and it's healing, and you're constantly running into friends and family, and the sportsmanship is one of the most powerful aspects of the games. Is all the athletes are there supporting each other and holding each other up, no matter your experience levels.
Many Alaska Native families still rely on subsistence living. Kelly Lincoln from Bethel, Alaska, showed physical agility skinning a seal in under 2 minutes and 8 seconds. The ear weight is another popular game. The strength resembles endurance to frostbite. This year's winner was Frank Lane from Kotzebue, Alaska, who made it 503 feet. This premier event originated as a form of communication. When whales or other game were hunted, a messenger ran back within sight of the village and would jump and kick on one or both feet in the air to communicate they were on their way back. In Phoenix, Drea Yazzie, Indian Country Today.
The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act set up corporations. If you were born before December 18, 1971, you became a shareholder. Unfortunately, that meant if you had siblings born after that date, they can't be shareholders. Today, the question is, who can be a full shareholder, and how can younger generations help shape the future? We have a partnership with Alaska Public Media to cover this complex story. ICT special correspondent Meghan Sullivan brings us this story of identity among Alaska Natives.
Alyssa London has always felt most at home with her Tlingit community.
I am a proud Tlingit woman who grew up with her family telling her who she is and where she comes from.
London knows her culture's past and lives out the values and traditions daily. It's the future she has questions about.
So I would like future generations to not have to defend their identity as much and to just be able to be raised with that sense of who they are and to just be able to continue to walk in the footsteps of their parents and grandparents and uphold that legacy.
This is a historic moment for the Native of Alaska.
When the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed into law, it established 12 corporations. Those who were at least 1/4 Alaska Native and born before December 18, 1971, were eligible to receive 100 shares in their corporation. So now, corporations are faced with a big decision. Open up enrollment to descendants born after the initial date, or stick with original shareholders only.
Anytime you have a policy that says you get this and you don't, it creates divide.
Corporations will also have to decide whether to allow descendants who are less than 1/4 Alaska Native to enroll.
If we continue to use blood quantum as a measure of how Native we are, there is a time in the future where there will no longer be Native people.
Ayu Kasatak, who's a Nupiaq, was born after the ANCSA deadline, meaning she couldn't enroll in her regional or village corporation. But last summer, her mom gave her a small number of shares. That means she can further contribute to her home region through her voting rights as a shareholder.
It really lit a fire within me to ensure that these corporations and organizations that represent Alaska Native people are inclusive of our Native people.
Alaska Native shareholders can't sell their shares, but they can pass them on in their wills or gift them to others. Some argue that the setup is fair because it doesn't dilute the worth of the shares. Others believe it is unreliable. Descendants might not get any shares or have enough to pass down to their children. Now a mom herself, Ayu is thinking ahead to how enrollment policies might impact future generations of Alaska Natives.
The much bigger picture is, what are we setting up for the future of these corporations if we are not including our people? 100 years from now, when the original shareholders of ANCSA are no longer with us, who will be the decision makers in our corporations? Who will have the votes?
6 out of 12 regional corporations have opened up enrollment to descendants of the original shareholders. In 2015, Chilista shareholders voted to open enrollment to descendants and remove blood quantum requirements. Their shareholder base has since grown from 13,000 to over 34,000.
We're very much about sharing in our community, helping others. Part of that was Chilista shareholders feeling that they wanted to share in the ability to enroll as a shareholder.
Chilista's communication director, Tom Leonard, was born 2 months before the ANCSA deadline, meaning he could enroll while his younger siblings couldn't. Once separated by an arbitrary date, his whole family is now able to be a part of the corporation.
Being able to provide and support those opportunities for the next generation is important.
Alex Lacey is one of those new shareholders. Lacey is part of Hooper-based tribe where her family is from. She lives in Anchorage and was able to enroll in Chilista as a descendant around a year ago.
So this is a picture of me and my grandma, and I'm considered the descendant of her, so she's the reason why I'm enrolled in Chilista.
While Lacey feels closer to her tribe, she values the educational and professional opportunities that her corporation provides.
They do, finance my school. I do get dividends. There's a lot of opportunities that are available to me from being a descendant from that region that I'm grateful for.
Shareholders will ultimately determine what happens to the corporations and the traditional lands they oversee.
in order for the lands to be in good hands in the future, in order for the corporations to be run well, that there needs to be more involvement of younger generations, either in board settings or in like leadership development roles.
London's excited to help shape what the next 50 years of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act will look like, alongside the new perspectives and dynamic thinking of other young Alaska Native shareholders. For Indian Country Today and Alaska Public Media, I'm Meghan Sullivan.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.